Genesis chapter 12. The title for today's message, and I'm tipping my hand a little bit with it, but is Abram schemes for himself. Okay? For himself. Abram schemes for himself. Everybody ready? Okay. We'll be looking at Genesis chapter 10 or chapter 12, verses 10 through 20. Why don't we pray, and we'll read the text, and we will begin. Heavenly Father, we yield this time to you and submit ourselves to your word and ask that it would have an impact on us in our minds and the lives that we live, our thoughts of you, the way our hearts go out in response to this passage of Scripture would be proper. Certainly acknowledge our need for your Spirit to do that work in us and to work through the Word as it's spoken and taught and also as it's received. Help me as well, Lord, to sit under your Word and not just to be a teacher of it, but a doer of the Word. I don't have any sense as to what it is specifically you have for each one who's here today, but we know your faithfulness to us, and so we pray with expectation to hear from you. In Christ's name we pray. Amen. Verse 10. Now there was a famine in the land. So Abram went down to Egypt to sojourn there, for the famine was severe in the land. When he was about to enter Egypt, he said to Sarai his wife, I know that you are a woman beautiful in appearance, and when the Egyptians see you, they will say, this is his wife. Then they will kill me, but they will let you live. Say you are my sister, that it may go well with me because of you, and that my life may be spared for your sake. When Abram entered Egypt, the Egyptians saw that the woman was very beautiful. And when the princes of Pharaoh saw her, they praised her to Pharaoh. And the woman was taken into Pharaoh's house. And for her sake he dealt well with Abram, and he had sheep, oxen, male donkeys, male servants, female donkeys, and camels. But the Lord afflicted Pharaoh and his house with great plagues because of Sarai, Abram's wife. So Pharaoh called Abram and said, What is this you have done to me? Why did you not tell me that she was your wife? Why did you say she is my sister, so that I took her for my wife? Now then, here is your wife. Take her and go. And Pharaoh gave men orders concerning him, and they sent him away with his wife and all that he had. Well, it's a curious story, to be sure. It's one none of us are very comfortable with. We don't like to know that our father Abraham acted in such a shameful way at any time in his life, even if it is early in his walk with God, in his knowledge of God and God's dealings with him. But it's here for us, unvarnished, it's here, and we've got to deal with it. Today we want to consider Abram's sinful scheme in Egypt, in which he lied about his wife in order to save and to enrich himself. There is a little more going on here in the story than people typically realize, but not so much that if you've read this a few times, you're not intimately familiar with all that really counts. But we will touch on some things that perhaps you've not noticed there in the text before as we work our way through. So I want to take the passage today under four headings, and they're certainly of varied length. But the first thing I want to do is just to move through the passage and spend a little time getting a good sense for what's happening in the story. So we'll just work our way through it. Second, I want to deal with some of the interpretive issues and decisions that come up as we try to understand the passage. Just people disagree on what certain things mean, how we should take them. And I'm not going to try to give you all the options. I just want to lay out for you kind of maybe what some of the sticking points are, and chart for you maybe a way forward, a way to understand some of those. The third thing I want to do is to consider some of the more important points that we ought to take from the passage that I think are just kind of right there for us, being thrust by Moses into our minds that we would take with us. And then lastly, I want to mention some of the applications for us today. Maybe not some of the main points of emphasis, but some things still we ought to take with us and remember as we move on from this story. But before we do any of those things, so maybe I'm cheating and maybe this is the fifth heading, I want to just briefly review some of what we've seen already in Abram's life, what we looked at last time in this call of God to Abram in verses 1 to 3, and then Abram's response and his obedience and his arrival in the land. I just want to remind you of the main points of that, so that's fresh in your mind. So just to begin then, last time we considered these two main things. We looked at the call of God to Abram, and exactly what it contained, and that's not often done. I think it's helpful to do that. Second, we considered Abram's faith and his obedience in following God's call and kind of the way he conducted himself once he got on the land. It's really helpful for us, I think, to see that and realize what's actually going on rather than just to read these events that happened, but to sit down and say, what is it telling us about Abram here? So we considered those two things, and let's just look at them briefly in turn. First of all, God's call to Abram, verses 1 through 3. Now the Lord said to Abram, "Go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you. And I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse, and in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed." You may remember we organized this call to Abram along the lines of two commands that are given him, two imperatives. And those are, first, in verse 1, go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you. First command. The second command is kind of at the end of verse 2, and it's not easy for us to see due to our translations, but you still get a sense of it. God says in verse 2 of all these things he's going to do for Abram, and he says, so that you will be a blessing. And actually that's a command, so that you will be a blessing. In other words, that I'm doing these things for the purpose of you being a blessing, and it's your obligation and your responsibility to be that blessing with the way that I've blessed you. And so two commands he's given. So this first one again, Abram is called to leave everything and go to a land that God would show him. He's told to leave his country, his kindred, and his father's house. That would mean at least not just leaving the security and the familiarity of those things, but also lifelong friends, right, wherever he was. What's more, it would mean a forsaking of these other gods that Abram had been following, putting himself into a position of danger with them, right? I mean, you've been serving them all the time because you're kind of afraid that, one, you think to be rewarded if you serve them, but two, you're afraid of what they might do if you stop. And now he's been told, just stop. Cold turkey, as the saying goes, right? Just no more. Abandon those gods entirely and come follow me into a land that you don't know, and for all Abram knows, with gods that you don't know and everything else. And so he goes. And so it's quite a thing, a command he's been given here. This isn't just a call of Abram. In a sense, it's kind of a conversion, right? He's been serving all these false gods. A living God shows up and speaks to him, and he decides to follow him. Even though following this God means abandoning all other gods, he goes. He was hazarding himself on the ability of the God who spoke to him to deliver and to make good on the reward that was promised. Like this God has promised me these things, and I'm going to go forsake these other ones because look what this one is promising me. Whatever gods he has, even if in his mind they are living, they're not promising him things like this. And this God has showed up and promised and assured him something, and he's going to go. And so he goes. The reward is that God would make him into a great nation. He would bless Abram. He would make his name great. That God would see to it that Abram was well established, with many descendants, with God's favor, and an exalted reputation. Those were the promises. Again, these blessings, though, were not an end unto themselves, and that leads us to the second command contained in God's call. He was called and commanded to be a blessing. The purpose of this favor from God was that so Abram would be a blessing to others. And this is put to Abram, again, as a command or an expectation for being one who would be in such a unique relationship to the true God that he would be in this position to bless others. This command includes with it other assurances. He says, so that you will be a blessing. And what are the other assurances? Now that you're going to take all that I've given you and try to be a blessing, verse 3, I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse. And in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. So God says that in this endeavor, if Abram goes to the land as he's commanded to, and as God is living with him in this way where he's blessing him and providing for him in these ways, and Abram takes that and responds and seeks to be a blessing to others, he has God's assurances that he will look after Abram and protect him, blessing those that bless Abram, whoever, as many as they are, and that any person, it's really worded this way in the original, any single person who regards Abram lightly and thinks he's unimportant and of no account, God will personally make sure that person is cursed. What a thing. The protection of God. He says, I must curse that person. Again, this is the way that God is assuring Abram of his protection as Abram obeys God in blessing others out of his relationship with God. God also says that this whole arrangement for Abram's life will be so successful in his efforts to bless others that every single family on the earth will receive of this blessing. That's incredible. In you shall all the families of the earth be blessed. So that's the first thing. That's the call. Then secondly, we considered Abram's faith and his obedience in following God's call. We saw just a couple things that I want to remind you about. First, remember that Lot went with him. That's, in a way, kind of curious. We don't know exactly why, but we could easily imagine Lot perhaps being taken up in the excitement of his uncle Abram's prospects in this new land after the living God had placed this call upon Abram's life. Like, I'm going to go with. I want blessing. And that would fit with what we know of Lot. Like, he kind of comes along to get some of the overflow of the blessing from Abram. Perhaps, though I think this is a little less likely, Abram is Lot's uncle. And so it may be that Lot is in Abram's charge. And that when Abram leaves his father's house, Lot goes with him because of the age difference and things that have happened in their history. Lot is kind of in Abram's household. That could possibly be. I think it's a little less likely because they split up later and it's not like Lot is seeking Abram's blessing in these things. They just go their separate ways as independent individuals with independent households. But we do find Lot kind of tagging along for a while. That's one thing. Lot went with him. Second thing, remember that once he arrived in the land of Canaan, Abram arrived at the place, it says, at Shechem. It's worded that way, the place. Some of the translations, some of the more loose translations that try to kind of give the sense and not just all the accurate words, they'll say, to the sacred place. And that's a good sense. They're going to the place. It says in verse 6, Abram passed through the land to the place at Shechem, to the oak of Moreh. And it's likely this place is a sacred shrine where the local Canaanites had served and done their various ceremonies and things and done teaching about whatever gods it was that they were serving at the time. We have later in Israel's history all the high places under the trees up on the hills where these gods are served. And it's much this way in Abram's time. And he gets down to Shechem and there's a place and he goes over there. Now what was Abram thinking? Who knows but that Abram thought perhaps that sacred place belonged to the God who told him to go here. I mean, we don't have any sense for sure what he was thinking as he approached up to this place, why he went there. Maybe this belongs to the God who called him. But we do see that God shows up. He passed Verse 6, Abram passed through the land to the place at Shechem, to the oak of Moreh. At that time, the Canaanites were in the land. That's there to remind you, these places belong to the Canaanites and their false gods. Don't think it was just any other place at Shechem. It belonged to the Canaanites. It was that kind of a place, underneath the terebinth tree at Moreh. Verse 7, Then the Lord appeared to Abram and said, To your offspring I will give this land. So God meets him at that place and appears to him. Before he had called to him, this is even more vivid. It's an appearance of the living God. Whatever that means, it was an appearance to him. So God does show up. But then there's this distinction in Abram's mind between the true God and the gods that are being worshipped in this place. The distinction is sufficient enough in Abram's mind that he builds a different altar to the Lord, to Yahweh, who had appeared to him. So whether he went up there knowing that it didn't really belong to the God that had called him, or whether once he got there and God appeared to him, he realized, wait a minute, the images and the stuff that's around here is nothing like what would belong to the God who's talking to me and appearing to me now. And he builds an altar to Yahweh. That's the word that's used here. An altar to Yahweh who had appeared to him. So this is his response. He sets up something new to this God. Right there on the site, which is kind of amazing. Pretty confrontational if you think about it. Going to build the next morning, some guy shows up, like, there's another altar. What's this about? It's to Yahweh. It's not to this God. What's it doing here? Why is it here? Third thing I want us to bring out is to remember that from there, Abram moved on further south to Bethel, where he pitched his tent and built another altar to the Lord. This time, God didn't appear to him. This time, he builds the altar kind of as a testament to God's promise. This is the land, this is the place. And from that altar, then he kind of used it as a place to come and call upon God. And that's what he does. He says he comes to Bethel and pitched his tent with Bethel on the west and Ai on the east, and there he built an altar to the Lord and called upon the name of the Lord. He's praying to God. Then we read he continued on still further toward the Negeb, which though not stated explicitly for us, the geography of this place was known to everyone who Moses is writing to. It's further south yet, and it's a lot more arid region, more dry. It's more like a desert. It's a lot harder to live out in that area, but there he goes on to that place. He journeyed on, still going toward the Negeb. It appears that and this is the last point by way of review, it appeared that as Abram was traveling through, he was not finding a place that he would like to settle the same way he had settled in Haran. Remember, he lived in Ur of the Chaldeans. He went up, settled for years in Haran. Then he comes on to the place. First place he comes to, God says, "This is the place," and he says, "Okay," and he goes. And it's like, why wouldn't you just live there? But he just goes on, and he gets to Bethel, and he builds an altar, and he prays to God. We don't know what he's praying about. And then he leaves, and he goes further. Now he's out in the middle of the desert. It's a little bit odd. So this was the land that God said he would give to him, but in some ways it was not at all to Abram's liking at this point. And he continued to move on from one place to another. This brings us then to the material for today. So, verse 10. Now, we begin to find out maybe a little bit about why Abram's just kind of passing through. Now, there was a famine in the land. There had been a famine in the land. So Abram went down to Egypt to sojourn there, for the famine was severe in the land. Now, archaeologists tell us, and I don't really know, you know how today we have floods along the Mississippi? And I've lived, evidently, through like every 100-year, 300-year, 500-year, 700-year flood. How they all just lined up right perfectly in my lifetime, I don't know. But whatever people mean when they say 500-year flood, they mean this level of flooding doesn't usually happen but once every 500 years. As to how accurate that is, I don't know. I don't put a whole lot of stock in it because of just my own personal experience. But I've read 3 different sources who have said that if Abram's lifetime is dated when we think it is, 2100 to 2000 BC, that there was at this time, real close, probably the same time, a 300-year famine, whatever that means, okay? I also know that later there's a famine in Joseph's life that seems worse than this one. So maybe that's a 1,000-year famine. I don't know. But for whatever it's worth, The famines did, in fact, seem to be really, really severe. People were coming down to Egypt. Why leave Canaan and go to Egypt? Well, because the climate in Canaan is one where it's dependent on the rain. You might have 1 foot of rain for the entire year in Canaan. But now you go to Egypt and they've got this Nile River, and it floods and everything's irrigated, and it's so much less dependent upon what happened in the rain over the last month. And so when there's a famine in the land, which is caused invariably by lack of rain, where do you go? You go to the place that doesn't need rain to have food. You go to Egypt. And that's where they went. Now, we read, "So Abram went down to Egypt to sojourn there, for the famine was severe in the land. When he was about to enter Egypt, he said to Sarai his wife, 'I know that you are a woman, beautiful in appearance. And when the Egyptians see you, they will say, "This is his wife." Then they will kill me, but they will let you live.'" That sounds strange to us. Really strange to us. I mean, I'm married, so I'm spoken for, but I mean, there are 2 of you men who are not, right? So when you see someone with a wife that you like, do you think, "I'm going to kill that guy and take his wife? That's what I'm going to do"? You don't think that way. But Abram's like, I know that's what's going to happen. They're going to see you, and they're going to kill me so they can have you. So the question I want to ask immediately is this even a reasonable fear? Is it reasonable for him to think this way, or is it just totally unfounded? Is he just given way to just totally unfounded fears? He's like imagining possible scenarios that could happen. I don't think so. We have it already in Genesis. You remember in Genesis chapter 6, whoever you interpret these sons of God to be, they were taking whomever they wanted from the daughters of men to be their wives. We see it in war. This happens all the time, right? We don't live in an age when this happens. At least we don't read about it in our newspapers, right? Some neighboring town wants your well, and so they go into your town and they invade and they kill all the men and they take all your wives for themselves. This happens. Regularly this happens. Let me put it to you another way. There's someone in the history of Israel who you really admire, and we talked about him some this morning already in our meetings. Some of the way he writes psalms about what God has done for him. And this man, even great King David, wanted another man's wife, and so he killed him so he could have her. Even David did that. So it's extremely likely. It's very possible. It's not an unreasonable fear. The only part of this that makes it unreasonable for Abram is that God told him, anybody who regards you lightly, I will personally curse. Like, I'll protect you. He promised to be with him, to be his God, to be a shield for him. And Abram's not living in that reality. He's not living as one who is trusting in these promises. He goes and he's afraid, and he forgets the promises of God, and he says, well, I've got to figure out, okay, this is what we're going to do. And that's the idea. Now, something else to just ask about. He says, I know you are a woman beautiful in appearance. Now, Abram, how many of you remember just from your times reading before, what the age difference is between Abram and Sarah? 10 years. Now, when Abram left Haran, he was 75 years old, which means Sarah is 65. They've journeyed some months down into the Promised Land. They've been there for probably a month or 2 or 3 or 4, however long they've been there. They get down to Egypt because there's a famine in the land. They get down there, however long that journey takes. And he says, now listen, they're going to say, you are so beautiful. You are incredible. They're all going to feel this way, right? And we tend to think, come on, right? So even today, when women generally die in their 80s, there are 65-year-old women who are attractive. It happens. It's rare. It happens. Sarah lived to be 127. So she's like midlife. Think early 40s, comparatively, right? She can be beautiful. She can be. She just can be. It's not like ridiculous for him to say this. And if, furthermore, what happens? Verse 14, when Abram entered Egypt, the Egyptians saw that the woman was very beautiful. They concurred. She is amazing. She's beautiful. So it's there. It's not entirely out of place that he's one, it's good that he thinks his wife is beautiful. That's great. But he's not wrong. It's the general consensus. I mean, people in Egypt get down there, and people in Egypt are thinking, she's amazing. Word gets all the way to Pharaoh about how beautiful this sojourner is. And she's, and the news also travels, she's a maiden. She can be married. So what a thing. All right, so then he says, the Egyptians will see you, they will say, this is his wife? Right? They're going to say, this beautiful woman is his wife? Well, let's kill him. And it's plural. Then they will kill me, but they will let you live. He's not thinking like Pharaoh might do this. He's like, anybody might do this. Any of these guys might try it. He's not just concerned about Pharaoh. But that does raise a little bit of an interesting point. Let me just say, if some of you kids particularly might have a map in the back of your Bibles. And if you can find one of the first ones, maybe the first or the second map in the back of your Bible, probably will show you part of Egypt. And if you were to look there, when Abram journeys down from the Promised Land into Egypt, he doesn't just because we know he has conversations with Pharaoh. Historians tell us that at this time the capital, or where Pharaoh was residing, was south of Memphis, which if you look at the Nile Delta, you have all these rivers come together. Memphis is further upriver, further south than that, and this is 60 miles further than that. So he's traveled hundreds and hundreds of miles into Egypt to have these conversations with Pharaoh. So he didn't just get down there to a little spot. He's like taking in the sights and checking out the pyramids and looking at the Sphinx. And I don't know what all he's doing there, but he's been traveling for a long time. It says he means to sojourn, which doesn't mean take up permanent residence, but it doesn't mean come for a weekend visit either. He means to wait out the famine, however long it takes. Right? He's not a weekend visitor. It's not a vacation. He's come to stay for as long as necessary. So he's gotten a ways in. Now, so it says, when Abram entered Egypt, the Egyptians saw that the woman was very beautiful. So what's the point here? What's the logic of this whole idea? Well, look, especially at this day and age, or at this time where he's talking, if I'm traveling with this beautiful woman and you want to marry her, and I'm her husband, I pose a threat, an obstacle to what you want. And you might want to get me out of the way. But if I'm her brother, she's available. And all that's necessary is that you do what's customary to obtain a wife. At this time, you secure an agreement by negotiations. You give gifts. You provide whatever it is you have and see if it's enough. And you work this thing out, and then you get the woman and they get the stuff, and off you're on your way. And it's no big deal. It doesn't raise kind of animosity and ill will. You're not jealous of him because he has a beautiful sister. You don't want to take what's his because he has a beautiful sister, but if he has a beautiful wife, then maybe you want to take her. Otherwise, you just want to obtain her in a way that's customary. And so this is the idea. They'll go down there and see how beautiful you are. They'll want you as their wife, and so they'll give me lots of stuff. I will live, and I'll be rich, and you'll still be alive, which you're going to be alive and be one of their wives anyway. Right? This is probably the thinking. It's incredible in view of that they even went to Egypt, in a sense. Like, what are you doing? What are you doing? As they're about to enter Egypt, this is what he's thinking. This is the plan. And then they go into Egypt, and they enact the plan. And everybody's leaving Abraham alone. These Egyptians say, man, she's really beautiful, but nobody's assaulted Abram at all. The plan is working so far. People are treating him well. Maybe not as well as he hopes to later, but he's respected. He's not assaulted, at least at this point. Nothing negative has happened. But then what do we read? And when the princes of Pharaoh saw her, or those who kind of in Pharaoh's court, they begin to see what happens. The woman was taken into Pharaoh's house. Taken. You could imagine, she's just gone, whisked away, taken into Pharaoh's house. And for her sake, he, that is Pharaoh, dealt well with Abram. And he had dealt well. That's the exact same phrase. Abram says, we'll get there, it'll go well, they'll deal well with me. And it says, and Pharaoh dealt well with Abram. So it's a one-to-one equation. When Moses records the words of Abram in his plan, he says, they'll deal well with me. When Moses records what Pharaoh did, he uses the exact same phrase and says, yep, he was right. It went really well for him. Now, how does Moses describe for us what well meant? What was it Abram had in mind? What was it that happened? And he had sheep, oxen, male donkeys, male servants, female donkeys, and camels. Lots of stuff. So he traded away his wife, that it would go well with him and that he would live. Now Sarah, we don't read about any protests from her, right, for her part. Before we want to, cast her as the victim in this entirely, and she certainly is that. Her husband should have done far better than he did. But she doesn't object. And what do they say about silence? It implies approval. Right? We don't read about her objection. She's not like getting into a fight with Pharaoh about this, like, I'll not be your wife or something. Like, it doesn't happen. She doesn't refuse to go. She's not taken away in chains because she won't go willingly. She plays along. Probably as an act of love to her husband. She agrees with him. It's her real danger, and he probably will die if the men decide to act in this way. And so that's her concern. Now, she's taken into Pharaoh's house. Then later you find Pharaoh said, I took her as my wife. The big question this raises to me is, unlike later when Abram does the same thing with this guy Abimelech, and it goes out of the way to tell us, in no way did Sarah and Abimelech have relations. It doesn't say that here. It in fact says she was taken as Pharaoh's wife. What does that imply, potentially? It implies exactly what we think, potentially, that she was in every way taken as his wife. That's possible. But let me offer you another possibility. Anybody remember Queen Esther? When she was taken into the courts of the king, she had to go through a 12-month beautification process. Remember, she was selected, first of all, because she was the most beautiful of all the maidens in the land. And from that place of being the most desirable, she was required by the king to spend the next 12 months improving herself physically for him. So it's very possible that she's taken into court and doesn't in any way lie with Pharaoh. And I don't care really which way you take it. Both ways are really bad, right? One is maybe worse. So there we have that. Notice also a couple other things. The way Moses tells the story, he kind of assumes, he talks about Sarah the way that people in the public would have thought about her. And this is interesting. Verse 14, when Abram entered Egypt, the Egyptians saw that the woman was very beautiful. He doesn't say that Abram's wife was beautiful. The woman. He just calls her the woman. There's this woman there, and she's very beautiful. And when the princes of Pharaoh saw her, they praised her to Pharaoh, and the woman was taken into Pharaoh's house. Right? But let's come down now. Verse 17. But the Lord afflicted Pharaoh and his house with great plagues because of Sarai, Abram's wife. No longer the woman, Abram's wife. So Pharaoh called Abram and said, what is this you have done to me? Why did you not tell me that she is your wife? Why did you say she is my sister, so that I took her for my wife? Now then, here is your wife, take her and go. It just totally changes, right? And now, that's actually the same word, woman, every time, but there's something added on to that word that shows possession, that makes it wife, your woman. You see, it's not just the woman. there was this woman, and she was very beautiful, and everyone thought it was just this woman. And so they took the woman, and then the woman went here, and the woman went there, and Pharaoh had the woman as his wife. But then what happened? The Lord afflicted Pharaoh and his house with great plagues because of Sarai, Abram's woman. She wasn't just a woman, she was Abram's woman specifically. And Pharaoh's upset. She was your woman. You didn't tell me she was your woman. You said she was your sister, not your woman, not your wife. We just translate your woman as your wife because that's the way we talk about it. So the story is told in this way as kind of what was perceived. What was perceived was it was just this woman, but then Pharaoh realizes, wait a minute, this is Abram's wife. And so the secret's out. Now, it says in verse 17, the Lord afflicted Pharaoh and his house with great plagues because of Sarai, Abram's wife. Literally, it's the Lord struck him with great plagues, plagued him with great plagues. So you ought to think about, this ought to sound familiar to you. If you think about it later on in Israel's history, when Israel was in Egypt again, there were great plagues that came upon Pharaoh and his house. Just like here. God not only was protecting Abram, he was in a way demonstrating his power over whatever religious system was being practiced by Pharaoh and the Egyptians. Remember, Pharaoh was the head of that system. Pharaoh and his house, great plagues because of Sarah. What were those plagues? We're not told. But it's specific enough that without any questioning of Abram or learning and investigating into the matter, Pharaoh knows the following. He knows that something about his relationship with Sarah is the reason for the plagues. He gets more specific. He knows that Sarah is actually Abram's wife. He knows that due to these plagues. And he also knows that Abram has lied to him, right? I mean, why did he say she is my sister so that I took her for my wife? He knows those things. He doesn't say, but now she's my wife and it's too late. He says, now then you take her and you get out of here. Pharaoh believes, it's like Abram's got a prior claim. And he acknowledges that. It's Abram's wife. But he knows all this simply because of what's happened to him. So something in these plagues, something in maybe a word from God, somehow maybe one of his those in his courts interpreted some dream or who knows what, and the plagues and who knows what they did. But God reliably got the information to Pharaoh. And you can imagine Abram when he's called to give an account. So Pharaoh called Abram and said, what is this you've done to me? Why did you not tell me that she was your wife? Abram's got to know that he's a dead man, right? There's no way he's going to be allowed to live. You have offended and wronged Pharaoh. Nobody's going to live. You thought that because you had a beautiful wife, Pharaoh or anybody else out here might kill you. Now that they've got a genuine beef and grievance against you, what hope do you have? You're in Pharaoh's court. It's over. So, you've got to know, Abram is completely shocked. How did he find out? Sarah, what did you tell him? What did you say? Who knows? She says, I didn't say anything. You talk about finger pointing and fear. Here he is in Pharaoh's court. Now, Pharaoh in this case he's a plaintiff in the case. He kind of brings a charge against Abram, and he's the plaintiff. You wronged me. But because he's Pharaoh, he's also the judge. Right? He's the plaintiff and he's the judge. And that's not a good position to be in when you're the defendant. When the plaintiff is the judge. You have no power. Right? This is so similar. I ought to remind you of things that happened earlier in Genesis, particularly like maybe Genesis chapter 3, when God shows up to the garden and says to the woman, what is this you have done? Just like Pharaoh says, what is this you have done? It's a formal charge. what have you done? You're not asking for an answer. You know what they've done. In a sense, you kind of explain yourself. Do you have any sense of the magnitude of the thing that you've done to me? Why have you done this? What have you done? And Pharaoh's further questions are that way. What is this you've done to me? Why did you not tell me she was your wife? Why did you say she's my sister so that I took her for my wife? Pharaoh's furious, and rightfully so. Now, in a lot of ways, it appears that Pharaoh is more God-fearing than Abram. God shows up to Abram not through plagues. God shows up to Abram through a call and then through an appearance, promising him to be his protector. And Abram ignores it. God shows up to Pharaoh, threatening him and causing plagues upon him and threatening him with worse. And Pharaoh does an about-face, calls Abram in, and lets Abram take everything that he had and goes and gives orders to his men. And Pharaoh gave men orders concerning him, and they sent him away with his wife and all that he had. Don't touch him. Get him out of here. Get him out of the land. Let him take everything he's got. He's go. Just let him go. That would never happen apart from what God has revealed, in a sense, and apart from Pharaoh having some fear of that. In many ways, I mean, think about the way this Pharaoh is better than the Pharaoh that exists during the Exodus. Because this Pharaoh, when he says, get out of here, he sends his men and they get him out of there, and he doesn't change his mind and say, wait a minute, she was really beautiful. Let's go get her. He doesn't do that. There's a sense of fear of God that Abram lacked, that later Pharaohs lacked. So it's quite a thing. Now, they sent him away. That's also the same word when it says, verse 20, and gave men orders concerning him, and they sent him away. That's the exact same word used in Genesis 3 when God drives out the man and the woman from the garden. They're expelled. They're forcibly sent out. So these men who were with Abram and Sarah and all that they had and the servants and everything weren't just kind of escorting them along so that they didn't linger. They weren't just escorting them along so that other people didn't attack them. They were, it's like, I got you by the arm and we are walking you, marching you out of our land. You're not welcome here. So there was, in a sense, some retribution. Pharaoh said, get out, and they had to go. There was no options about it. They weren't allowed to stay in the land. The famine's still on, you understand. But now they can't live in Egypt. So they go back now, disgraced, with lots of stuff, more people to feed, more animals to care for, into a land that's in the middle of a famine that they had to flee when they hardly had anybody to take care of. It's not a good situation. They're enriched. They have more, but there's still a famine. So that is generally, those are the events. Now then, some of these interpretive decisions in the story. This one I almost didn't mention, but I hear it all the time in not all the time, but a lot of times in some of the older commentaries, and you'll hear it in preaching from maybe a couple generations ago. If you listen to some old messages and stuff, people will talk about going down to Egypt, right? Going down. They went down. It's always bad. You read that, they went down from here. They went down to there, and it's always negative. And they'll say specifically going down to Egypt. The one I always use, my rebuttal to that is always, what about when Jesus Christ went down and took refuge in Egypt? It's not worded quite the same way. But they'll always talk about this going down it's a negative thing. And so my way I want to say that is just being too down on moving down, right? And here's what I want to say, just to ask the question, should Abram have gone? Probably not. Probably not. Look at Genesis 26, verses 1 and 2. It's a really helpful text on this. Here's Isaac. Now, we know about the famine in Joseph's time, right? We got Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob's son, Joseph. But here, for Genesis 26, now there was a famine in the land, besides the former famine that was in the days of Abraham. And Isaac, this is Abram's son, Isaac went to Gerar, to Abimelech, king of the Philistines. And the Lord appeared to him, another appearance, and said, do not go down to Egypt, Dwell in the land of which I shall tell you. Sojourn in this land, and I will be with you, and will bless you. For to you and to your offspring I will give all these lands, and I will establish the oath that I swore to Abraham your father. It's like God is graciously preempting Isaac's sin. It's like the fear is Isaac's going to mess up the same way Abraham messed up. And so he comes and says, listen, don't do what your father did. There's a famine. Don't go down to Egypt like Abraham did. You stay in the land that I tell you. What land is that? This land, he says. Dwell in the land of which I shall tell you. Sojourn in this land, and I will be with you. Didn't God promise basically that same thing to Abraham? I'll be with you. I mean, I'll bless those who bless you, curse those who curse you. I will be with you and will bless you. For to you and to your offspring I will give all these lands. He was reminding him of the same thing that God had promised his father. And I will establish the oath that I swore to Abraham your father. All those things I promised to Abraham, I'm going to establish it with you. He's just telling him, I want you to depend on the same promises that I gave to Abraham. The promises that he mentions are the ones that Abraham had when Abraham decided to leave the promised land. But here God's saying, don't go there. You stay here, depend on me, and I'll bless you. So it seems like, I feel like we're warranted to say that Abram should have stayed. That even though going down to Egypt doesn't imply something bad, in Abram's case, it does. He should have known better. Right? As was said earlier today, sinful forgetfulness. Right? He should have remembered these promises. Abram was not the only one to do this at this time. Lots of people would go down to Egypt because that's where you could get bread. But think that Abram had just seen God appear to him and tell him what land was in fact promised to him. Leaving that land seems entirely a bit less like faith and more like human reason. And we're probably not wrong in that assumption. It wasn't much faith that sent him down to Egypt, but just kind of, well, where am I going to get my food? He wasn't looking at God. So again, as a whole, Abram's journey is probably to be seen as a violation of the earlier command in 12:1. What was the command? Go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you. He gets to the promised land. God says, this is the place. And then he goes to Egypt. God told him to stay there. What's his reason for going to Egypt? Well, there's a big old famine going on. That's why I'm leaving. So think of it this way. When Abram goes to Egypt, he breaks both commands that God gives him. First command, live in this land, and he goes to Egypt instead. Second command, be a blessing. Take the things I've given you and shown you and be a blessing to others. And he's anything but a blessing here. Anything but a blessing. So that's an interpretive issue. So he breaks both commands. He's a liar and a deceiver, a thief in a sense because he's taking these things on false pretenses. It's terrible. He's not, in a sense, if you were Sarai's father and you could do it over again, you wouldn't choose Abram. He's failed her terribly, and he's shown himself to be a man of less than admirable character, at least at this point in his life. Not too much that's great about Abram. Things looked so good, didn't they, in the first 9 verses? I mean, it's like, man, Abram, he's building these altars right in these false gods. He says, there's an altar to the true God. How bold. This is great. And he left everything to come to this land. And then we're not exactly sure why he's kind of going through it, but he's there, at least. He's there in the land. It's encouraging. And then we get here and it's just like, what a failure. So here's another interpretive issue that we have to kind of reckon with, deal with. Did Abram intend for Sarai to marry another person or not? You get people on different ideas on this. It's hard to say entirely for sure. I certainly fall on the side that said he did intend to send her away as a wife for some other person. But either way, he showed an awful disregard for Sarah and a real lack of faith and trust in God. But let me just lay it out for you just briefly. On the one hand, it seems there are 2 different things that happen. First of all, the ruse or the lie seemed to have worked in verse 14. We read, when Abram entered Egypt, the Egyptians saw the woman was very beautiful. And it just seemed like things are good, like they're leaving him alone and it's worked. But then kind of unexpectedly, people in power see her and they say something to Pharaoh. And Pharaoh's just the kind of guy who says, well, get her. Get her. You could imagine, we could imagine all kinds of scenarios. Does guards for Pharaoh just come in and just take her? I don't know. Do they invite him in to the palace? And Pharaoh says, they all tell me her sister. She's your sister. This is what I'm offering you. I'm going to double what I normally offer. Or who knows what, right? You're in the palace. How do you say no to this? So what do? You just say, actually, we've been lying to you all, and you're terrified. You just kind of, right? Isn't this what happens with a lie? You tell a lie, and then all of a sudden, you're in a situation where it's, you've got to kind of dig in deeper and make this worse. You got to go through things you didn't mean to go through, so you don't get caught in the lie until you make it worse. And here's Abram, and he's before Pharaoh, and he's like, "Yep, she's my sister, and you can have her for. Can I have a couple more camels?" Like, what is he supposed to do? It's a bad situation, but this is what I don't know how else to envision. Somewhere between these kind of scenarios is where the truth has to lie. This is what happened. It says, and for her sake he dealt well with Abram. Right? So Abram gets all kinds of sheep and oxen and male donkeys, male servants, female donkeys, and camels. He gets all kinds of stuff. So perhaps out of fear, they were not able to stop what was now in process because of the power of the one who had set his eyes on Sarah. We didn't think Pharaoh was going to want her. We just thought somebody else. When we planned this, we weren't thinking, how are we going to get by and escape Pharaoh, right? Maybe Abram's thinking, listen, what we'll do is when people see you, they'll come and they'll start negotiating, and we'll just never come to terms, and eventually we'll just leave. That would be... It's still a lie. It's still wrong. It's still not trusting God. But he's not meaning to give her away. But something happened and now he can't stop it. Right? That's reasonable. I can look at the text and think, yeah, I can see that. But then on the other hand, I think there are several factors. First, Abram said it's going to go well for me when I go down there, which might just mean I won't be harmed. But because of the way Moses writes later, it seems like when Moses says, yeah, and it did go well for him. And this is what we mean by well. And he tells us exactly what well was, how well he was dealt with. Seems to be exactly what Abram meant. Second, Pharaoh clearly interprets Abram's actions as morally wrong. He gives a formal charge of transgression to him. Pharaoh's ticked. He's not like, well, it's not like Abram and Sarah were in the palace or something before Pharaoh, and Pharaoh just took her. And it was and abused his power over Abram and Sarah, right, against their will, and now he's having to come and say, well, I kind of wronged you, I shouldn't have taken her, now I know why you were reluctant. He says, why did you deceive me? So Pharaoh feels wronged and levels that charge against him. And Abram makes no rebuttal, he just leaves. He's not like, no, you misunderstand. No, Pharaoh understands perfectly well. You deceived him so that you could get all this stuff. He's furious. Third, once Pharaoh discovers the truth, he calls Sarai Abram's wife. He doesn't say well, I stole her from you and now she's my wife and we got to deal with it. He's like, she was your wife. He backs off of this thing of she's my wife. He says she's your wife. So it doesn't seem like Sarah was taken in a way that would be wrong, that Abram couldn't have objected to. Fourth thing, Pharaoh allows Abram to leave unharmed. And that just, again, I think shows greater fear of God that he has than that Abram had. But here's the fifth thing, and this is a clincher for me. There's one other place in Abram's story where another relative of his is literally the same verb, said to be taken. Now in this instance, his wife is taken. And he does nothing. He just enjoys the spoil of the deceit. But in the other case, when his nephew Lot was taken, Abraham goes and gets whatever men he can find, and they go and they travel more than 100 miles north and get these guys by night, armies of people, and they make war. And they rescue his nephew. If Sarah was taken from Abram against his will, wouldn't he have put up some sort of fight? It sounds like a guy who would have put up some form of resistance. Not just said, well, time to leave, or whatever, I'll ride my camel out of Egypt. So it just seems like Abram was complicit in this. He was willing to let Sarai go. Does that make sense? Again, I don't care so much where you land on this. I just I lean this way because of the various things I see in the text. But I can see it happen in the other way too. So did Abram intend for Sarah to marry one another or not? Again, it's hard to say entirely for sure, but either way, wherever you land on this, it was totally wrong for him to do this. He showed an awful disregard for Sarah and a real lack of faith in God. Next question. Why did Pharaoh not harm Abram? I've kind of already alluded to this a little bit in the terms of why didn't he harm Abram? Why didn't he retaliate? Well, he had heard from God in some way. These plagues had told him, what had happened. But if the plagues if all he heard from God was just what's happening is because this man deceived you and made you do something really wrong, then he would just execute Abram. Like, why wouldn't he? Like, he executes everybody else who does him wrong. This is the man in the same position of power, at least that later is just killing males in male Israelites just because there's a lot of them, right? Not the same Pharaoh, but the same position. So there's a verse in the Psalms that I think speaks directly to this, and I just want you to turn there, if you would. Psalms 105. This is the Bible's, I think, clear answer as to this question. Why did Pharaoh not kill Abram? Psalm 105 and verse 14. But let's back up, just so everyone gets it, to verse 11. Saying, to you, I will give the land of Canaan as your portion for an inheritance. Verse 12. When they were few in number, of little account, this is the people that God meant to give the land to, namely Abraham and his descendants. When they were few in number, of little account, and sojourners in it, wandering from nation to nation, from one kingdom to another people, he allowed no one to oppress them. He rebuked kings on their account, saying, touch not my anointed ones, do my prophets no harm. Now, later, everybody remembers that Abram did this twice in his life, right? He tried this ruse twice. Now, when Abimelech, he does it to Abimelech, Abimelech is specifically told not to touch Abram, and he specifically said, Abram is specifically called by God to be a prophet. Okay? So we might say, well, this text is talking about what happened with Abimelech, and only that incident. Well, notice what it says. Verse 14, he allowed no one to oppress them. He rebuked kings, plural, on their account, saying, what kinds of things did God say when he rebuked these multiple kings? Well, what he said was this kind of thing, touch not my anointed ones, and do my prophets no harm. So that's the kind of thing that Pharaoh evidently is told. It's inexplicable that he lets Abram go, unless he's got some kind of a warning from the God who's afflicting him to let him go. Let him keep everything and just keep him intact. Don't assault him. And so he doesn't. But he gets him out of there. He doesn't take anything away from him and sends him out. Ejects him out of Egypt. I think that's the only explanation I can give for why in the world Abram is allowed to escape with his life. Because God intervened and warned Pharaoh not to touch him. And so there we have it. Now, if that's true, let's move on to the next heading. Significant points to be made in the story. if it's true that God intervened to protect Abram, and I think no matter what we'd say he did because he sent the plagues, but even more specifically, he said, don't you harm him. Then God kept his word about the curse. You remember that? God says, down to a man, any person, any individual who treats you with contempt or treats you lightly, I must curse. And God did it. For all of Abram's failures, God was still true. I mean, part of the reason that Abram was in this situation, though he sinfully was not trusting God, was also because people were kind of threatening him. People put them in a situation where they didn't respect him and his wife the way they should have. He knew, I'm going to a land where this is the way they treat people. And he got there, and they treated him that way. And God said, no, you'll not treat Abram that way. I'll guarantee it. And he did. He acted on it. And they didn't treat Abram that way anymore. Why didn't everybody get this protection from God? Because God promised it to Abram. He said, this is what I'm going to do for you. What an opportunity this would have been, could have been, had Abram not lied, for Abram to be a source of blessing to Pharaoh. Let's suppose Abram goes in and says, this is my wife, and they say, really? And they come and Pharaoh just takes her, and Abram's in prison waiting to be executed or something. God has shown in the way that he did deliver them that he was more than able, he would have been able to deliver them in that situation too. Whatever the worst possible scenario Abram could imagine might happen to them down in Egypt because of being married to Sarah, like God was able to protect them, like more than able. It's not a problem. What an opportunity lost then to be a source of blessing to these Egyptians. Here's a nation. You're going to be all the nations of the earth, and you go to one. And you're just, all that results from your coming is they are poorer. God is maligned because of God's association with you, who are just a liar and a deceiver. And the leader of that country is under a curse of God. Congratulations, Abraham. Way to bring the blessing of God to people. What an absolute failure. The encouraging thing is, just as God promised to curse those who curse him, he also promised that the blessing will in fact come. It will come. So God's not done with Abram. It's not over by a long shot. But again, I mean, here Abram, he was not in a position now to speak about the virtues of God. No position at all. Because of his own lying and his deception, had forfeited his welcome, and then through association had brought the shadow of his own moral corruption upon God in the eyes of the Egyptians. Now, it didn't rightfully belong to God. God wasn't complicit in this. But undoubtedly, the God who protected that deceiver is not going to be regarded well by the Egyptians. This is the way it is. The Gentiles blaspheme because of you, right? This is what Abram's experiencing. We also learned something else. I think God's intention for the promise includes Sarai. Period. We learned that. There was no reason, really, for Sarai to continue, for Abram not to just go. God intervened to protect Sarai and to keep Sarai with Abram. He wanted them together. Abram, if God had only meant the promise for Abram alone, and Sarah, it doesn't have any application to Sarah, then Abram can go with all his stuff, and he's blessed, and Sarah, hey, she's a queen. Good for her. No, nothing lost. But in God's mind, this is not an acceptable situation. Abram's over here lying. Sarah's complicit. The couple, the man and the woman through whom I want to bring this promised seed, they're not even together anymore. And God says, no way. And he brings them back together and sends them on their way back into the land of promise. So God means for Sarai to be included in the promise. We could kind of infer that if we think about the things that were said earlier in chapter 11. When it talks about Terah and his descendants, and it says, here was Abram and he was married to Sarah. Now Sarah was barren. He's married to this woman who's barren, and his name means exalted father. And God says, look, I want to make a great nation of you. Go on. And Abram and Sarah go. So we might infer that God, when God thinks of Abram, he thinks of Abram not as just a man with a name that says Exalted Father, but it's a man with a name that says Exalted Father, who's not a father because his wife is barren. God says, these two who are united together, I'm going to do something there, something wonderful. And that's what he does. So in God's mind, it's not acceptable for Abram and Sarah not to be together. Now, does Abram learn that lesson here? I don't know. I don't know exactly. But he certainly realizes that God's not willing to let him just be this kind of a liar, this deceiver, this opportunistic kind of person. And when we find him later in Genesis 13, he's not that way. He's learned the lesson. He's humbled himself. And you see that in chapter 13. Let's just look at a couple verses just so we get this closure to the story. Chapter 13, verse 1. So Abram went up from Egypt, he and his wife, and all that he had, and Lot with him. Now there hadn't been any mention of Lot yet, that Lot had gone down. But evidently Lot goes down there, right? Lot goes with him into the Negev. They're coming back. Now they're into the Negev now. Now Abram was very rich in livestock, in silver and in gold, and he journeyed on from the Negev as far as Bethel, to the place where his tent had been at the beginning, between Bethel and Ai, to the place where he had made an altar at the first. And there Abram called upon the name of the Lord. And so he goes back. He goes back into the land, takes everything he's got with him. They get back right. He goes right back to that altar where he called on God earlier, and he calls on God again. There's a sense of a repentance. He comes back right back to where he had been. This is kind of where things went wrong for him. He left there. The last time he'd made an altar to God was here. Since then, he left. He went to the Negev. Then he went to Egypt. All this happened. Now he's come back. He says, okay, God, here I am. And he cries out to God. There's a real sense of repentance, I think. But I don't think there's any other way to read that. Now, some other applications for us today. Many times, I think we bemoan the way that these great stories are just turned into moralistic stories, right? There's things like, some of these great stories, like, you've got the boy who has his bread and the fish and the loaves, and God multiplies it and provides all these things, and it's kind of turned into, well, you should share. It's good to share. It's like, you've missed the whole point of this story, right? And we don't want to take stories like this story with Abram and say, it's not good to lie. This is an example of that, but certainly there's a lot more going on here than that. And so we just bemoan this, and I think the tendency then can be to take all that we've learned and to not be willing to go and look at kind of the moral aspect of the story. And sometimes I think that's good. We don't want to always just look at that. But here's one thing I want to say on this. It's not okay to ignore these moral lessons that are here. And more than that, if we've seen anything so far in the things that I've shared about Abram, it's that, particularly when we looked at his whole life and all these stories and the way they go together, is that the redemptive kind of arc, the purposes of God for Abram, are to take him from this kind of person into a different kind of person who's godly, who's upright, and is moral. That's in his case, that is the arc, that is the redemptive, that is the big thing. Is we're taking this man and we're changing him into a man that God can use and work with. So the kind of man who would willingly say, if you want my son, I'll give him to you. And trust God for it. He's not able to trust God for almost anything right now. He left the land, but it's kind of fits and starts. It's good for a little while and really bad. And he's a liar, he's a deceiver, he's not a guy you'd want to travel with. This is Abram. And he's learning these hard lessons. But we're also seeing the provision of God for him, and the care that God takes, and the protection God has for him. So, just to say that this is a big part of Abram's story. When we go into these stories, a big part of things that we're going to find are some of these lessons that he learns, because they were lessons God was teaching him at this time. That's the point of this. That actually is the point of the text in some of these stories. Moreover than that, let's say this. It's also God's main purpose in your life, right? Not many of us are going, if it's true that Paul could say, not many of us are teachers, right? Well, less of us are missionaries. Less of us are the ones who, like, in 100 years from now, if the Lord tarries, Christians will be reading our biography saying, do you see what God did in their life? Look at how God opened up massive areas for the gospel through this person. Like, that's just not going to be us, more than likely. Your great purpose in all of redemptive history is to become more like Christ than you are. To learn these kinds of lessons, to be godly. That's the point. And these are the things that Abram's learning. And if these things don't thrill us, and if we don't take something from these lessons, we're missing it. The same thing God taught Abram here, He's meaning to teach you. He means for you to live by that same lesson. This is for you. I just want to look at two texts on this. And they're common. We know them. But the first one in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, 2 verses here. Speaking about the wilderness generation and who made it out of the Exodus, but were wandering around in the wilderness. It says, now these things took place as examples for us. What kind of an example? That we may not desire evil as they did. Now down to verse 11. Now these things happened to them as an example, but they were written down for our instruction, on whom the end of the ages has come. So for them, their story, the thing that happened, listen to that, it happened as an example. They took place as examples for us. Their original taking place in history happened as an example for you. Doesn't it have a long trajectory through redemptive history? That thing way back then happened, it happened as an example for you. Now, it was also written down for you, upon whom the end of the ages has come, that you would get this lesson. That you wouldn't desire evil as they did. God's purposes was that He had a people after His Son had come and gone into heaven, us upon whom the end of the ages has come. He wants us to live a certain way, and He wants us to gain that lesson. So we've got to gain it from those stories, or we don't get it. God's wasted His time. If we read these stories and we don't say, what's the moral application for me now? How does this teach me to not desire evil now in my life? You miss it. Paul says that's why they were written down, for the benefit of those upon whom the end of the ages have come. So we go back to read these stories. We shouldn't be thinking, well, this is something that happened a long time ago. I'm not really sure how it applies to me. We should be thinking, why is it? What is the lesson here in this story meant for me, which God has preserved for thousands of years, that I could read it today and benefit from it now and apply it to the rest of my life? That's what Paul's saying plainly. Don't regard these things lightly. Don't think of what Abram did as well. That's kind of a weird thing. Sit there until you know what you're supposed to take from it. Till you've learned these lessons. One other text is just in Hebrews chapter 12 and verse 1. Hebrews 12:1. Everybody remembers Hebrews 11, right? This great faith hall of fame. And all these stories are recounted about how this person believed God and that person believed God, and how God, by faith they did things that seemed to be impossible. And we look at that and we kind of think, oh, I don't have any great feat in my life, that I don't really fit in that group. And we can read it in that way. But in chapter 11, verse 39, it says, and all these, though commended through their faith, they were commended because of the things they did. It was good. It's right for us to speak well of them. They didn't receive what was promised. The ultimate thing that was promised is something that was later. It was through Christ. Since God had provided something better for us, that apart from us, they should not be made perfect. It's like in all their stories about these great things that God has done for them and the great victories they've won for God. That's good. But there's something, if we read those stories, it's like there's something lacking. It's not glorious enough. But then you get to us who are believing in Christ and forsaking all, and we have this gospel account and we're trusting it and we're sending forward that message into the world. It's like, man, now the story is complete. Now we've got something to really talk about. It's all here together. All their great acts of faith, it wasn't really complete until we had New Testament Christians. and the work of Christ to proclaim to the world and to live for and to suffer for the sake of. Therefore, chapter 12, verse 1, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us also lay aside every weight and the sin which clings so closely, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us. So the application is, you read those stories, take heart, take encouragement. Yes, don't look at them and say, well, it's not as great as having the gospel. Like, think, they just had that, and this is what they did. Look how God helped them. And they're urging me forward. Their life is a testimony to me. And I've got all these witnesses. And the application for my life is fight sin. Press on with Christ. Keep believing. That's the application. The great things for you to do in your life are to cast that sin aside. It clings so close. Get rid of it. You want to put armies to flight? Get rid of sinful desires. Gain the mastery over these things. Let us also lay aside every weight and the sin which clings so closely, and run with endurance that race that is set before us. That's what these examples are for. They apply. In their details, they apply. We don't just want to ask, like, well, how did this story fit into redemptive history all down through, and like, typologically, what does this story mean? And how does it similar to another story that comes later? That stuff is all interesting. And there's much to be gained from asking those questions. And I ask those questions all the time and teach you those answers because they're important for us to fit our whole Bible together. But that's not always the application. That's just information. The application is live. If we see Abram's mistake, then don't you do likewise. Live higher than that. So then, base application I would give, among all these other things that are important for us to know, I've taught a lot of things today, and I've not said this yet, and I'm going to say it now. This is what I would say, kind of this base application. Think about conversations you've had with people, particularly unbelievers, but even believers. People might think, we kind of have these hypothetical situations. Is it okay to murder, or is it okay to lie in such and such a situation? And they kind of give all these details and say, could you lie there? Could you do this? Could you do that? That's kind of what we're talking about. Abram, that wasn't Abram there. He's getting ready to go to Egypt, and he's like, well, hypothetically, what I think is probably going to happen. And so he's kind of reasoning it all out. Here's what we're going to do. And this is what's going to work out. And it's all justified in his mind because of the risk, right, of the situation that's going to come. People might think that to escape, this is a quote from somebody, people might think that to escape from some difficult situation, they may scheme deceptively, albeit bordering on the truth so that it's not an outright lie. But from this passage, we learn that in such deception, the blessing of God may be jeopardized, right? You might be able to figure out a way that, in your own thinking, I can navigate this situation, tell some lies and kind of save face and do things and get through to the end of this situation unscathed and unharmed for all the things that have happened. And I've figured out a way through this hypothetical situation. I've got it worked out. I know the answer to this dilemma. But you do that and you risk losing everything God's promised, right? You risk the favor of God. You risk the blessing of God. You risk God's help. You lose it. Just like Abraham in many ways lost it there while he was in Egypt. Even if I read this story in the best possible light for Abram maybe did not intend to lose his wife. If I say that's the best possible way I can interpret this for Abram. The lie made things worse. Again, as the risk they took backfired in the worst possible way. If it was totally unforeseen that Pharaoh would do this, well, then it backfired terribly. All their scheming, all their reasoning, all their planning was totally useless in the real world. It wouldn't withstand the real world. But God actually overcame their error in a way that demonstrates He was more than able to protect them even without a lie. I said that already. Right? They messed up. God overcame their error and put things right for them in a sense in such a way that shows that He was more than able to protect them in the beginning. They didn't need to do this. Plus, again, Abram already had the clear promise of God on this point. It was fundamentally a lack of faith in God's character that God maybe wouldn't keep His word, that God maybe wouldn't curse those who treat us ill. We've got to figure this. God's not going to be enough. He's doubting God. One other thing to point out on this, the same point, I think it's really worth pointing out that Abram suffered for years because of this whole thing here in Egypt. I want to draw that out for you. First of all, when they get back to Canaan, he and Lot, who had been together and traveling together and spent Lot's whole life with Abram. I mean, Lot traveled with him out of Ur of the Chaldeans. They were with him all the whole time in Haran, and now they're down in the Promised Land. He goes down with them to Egypt. They come back up. What happens? Strife. Strife. Why? Because of all their stuff. You thought all the stuff was a blessing. It wasn't just an unmixed blessing. There's so much stuff that all the herdsmen there's strife there, and so they have to split. That eventually, of course, cost Lot terribly, right? No longer on the influence of Abraham. And we see the end of Lot. What else? Later, in the story of Abraham, there's this Egyptian that shows up. This Egyptian servant. Stop for a second. Where did Abram get servants from Egypt? Here. So they go back. And what happens? Sarah says, now listen, I've got this Egyptian maidservant named Hagar. Why don't you lie with her and she'll bear a child and that'll be much. And then what does it produce? Just strife in the family. And then later God says, I'm going to give you another son, and Abram's heart is broken. He says, no, Ishmael, let Ishmael live before you, my son Ishmael. God says, no, send him away. I mean, what a thing. This caused Abram heartache for years and years and years. It wasn't just the bad situation while they were in Egypt. It cost them a long time. Now, many of those things cost them because they were further compounded by other mistakes, other sins, but certainly they had their source here. We don't know for a fact that Hagar came into this house in Egypt, but it seems the most likely place. So, these hypothetical situations, right, they don't come up with your own solutions to these things, right? We've got to cast ourselves on God. Rather, your time would be better spent. Let's say this. Here's the application. Some difficult situation comes. Your time is probably better spent recounting the promises of God that apply to that situation and you in it than scheming for a way to get out of the situation. I'll say that. At the very basis, we could say that. Your time is better spent reminding yourself of the promises of God that apply to you now and living in light of those. Maybe there are conditions to those promises. Maybe you need to meet the conditions. Recall those promises. Recall the commands of God. Abram was told to stay in this land, settle there, and he didn't. Right? What has God commanded you to do? What has God promised He will do for you if you're walking in His commands? Do those things. Don't figure out ways to kind of get out of this and tell half-truths and everything else. Don't try to save face. Let God do that for you. Remember, it was God who said, I'll make you a great name. Right? That's what God promised to Abraham. One of the things. Well, anyway, that's some application. That's generally this story here of Abram scheming to save himself. It's not a highlight in his life at all. It's not the kind of story, if it happened in your history, you would want published. But here it is. Any questions or comments on this?